You know, the bottom line is, since Paul said that the resurrection would be at the end, that if we can identify what end Paul has in mind, then that absolutely determines one of two things. It determines that the nature of the resurrection must conform to the time of the resurrection. If a person wants to maintain a given view of the nature of the resurrection that violates the undeniable, indisputable time that the Bible sets for the resurrection. For instance, if a person, as many do, wants to affirm that Paul has to be speaking of the resurrection of a physical body out of the dirt, and yet we find the indisputable evidence that the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15 was to be at the end of the Old Covenant age in AD 70. A person has one of two choices. Absolutely reject the time statements, and unfortunately and tragically, some former preterists have now resorted to that kind of drastic, dramatic, false position, or acknowledge that, yes, it was supposed to be a physical resurrection, and it was supposed to be in AD 70, therefore the prediction failed, as is the case of many skeptics. Look, folks, we have to bring our understanding of the nature of the resurrection into conformity with the timing of the resurrection, and not create a dichotomy or a contradiction in those. Now, Paul said the resurrection would be at the time of the end. He uses harvest imagery. I've been sharing with you that the harvest, the resurrection harvest at the end of the age of Matthew chapter 13 is in fact the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15. Now, there are only a handful of futurists who would deny that. Now, what's absolutely interesting to me is that you have some commentators, for instance, Gary DeMar, Joel McDermott. They admit that the harvest of Matthew chapter 13 was in AD 70. And yet they try to create a different resurrection harvest in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. I'm sorry, that just doesn't work. Now, I want you to notice the following. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 13, verse 43, that at the time of the coming of the Son of Man, the time of the harvest, at the end of the age, then when? End of the age, coming of the Son of Man, time of the harvest. Then shall the righteous shine forth in the kingdom of their God. Well, folks, this is a direct echo of Daniel chapter 12, verse 3. Daniel chapter 12, verse 2, prediction of the resurrection. Verse 3, the righteous shining forth in the kingdom. Verse 4, the time of the end. What end? The resurrection at the end of 1 Corinthians chapter 15. You know, it absolutely astounds me at the desperation of some former preterists in seeking now to go to Daniel chapter 12 and claim that Daniel chapter 12 verse 1 was fulfilled at one time, but Daniel chapter 12 verse 2 through 5 speaks of the end of time in a parenthetical discussion, without giving a single exegetical, a single grammatical justification for it. It is just like, oh, well, verse 1 is different from verse 2. Folks, this is unmitigated desperation. There is no justification for this. When a person has a presuppositional theology that violates the contextual flow of the text, you know there's something wrong with their theology. Now watch this. In Daniel chapter 12, verse 6, one angel asked another, when shall these things be? When shall these things, what things? The antecedent reference is to the tribulation, the resurrection, the righteous shining forth in the kingdom, which is the resurrection at the end of Matthew 13 and 1 Corinthians 15. When shall these things be? When will all these things be fulfilled? Verse 7. Another angel lifts his hands to heaven and says, when the power of the holy people has been completely shattered, all. Did you notice? He didn't say some. He didn't say, now you have to understand that verse 1 is one subject and verse 2 and following is a different subject. And I'm not talking about verse 2 and following now. I'm talking about only about verse 1 and other unrelated subjects, unrelated to verse 2 and following. No. When the power of the holy people has been completely shattered, all of these things. Look, folks, once again, the antecedent reference demands that the discussion is about the tribulation, the resurrection, the righteous shining forth in the kingdom, and the time of the end. And that would all be fulfilled. All of it would be fulfilled when the power of the holy people was completely shattered. To put that in simplified form, the resurrection at the time of the end of 1 Corinthians 15:19 and following is the resurrection harvest of Matthew chapter 13, 39 to 43. But the time of the end resurrection harvest of Matthew 13, 39 to 43 is the resurrection harvest at the time of the end when the righteous would shine forth in the kingdom of Daniel chapter 12. But the time of the end resurrection harvest of Daniel chapter 12 would be fulfilled when the power of the holy people was completely shattered. Therefore, the resurrection harvest at the end of 1 Corinthians chapter 15 would be fulfilled when the power of the holy people was completely shattered in AD 70. I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen, this is simply unanswerable. It is irrefutable. Unless you can prove textually, contextually, exegetically, using proper hermeneutic, and not just simply saying, well, Daniel 12:1 is one thing, Daniel 12:2 and following are different things. That's not enough, and that is no proof. So unless you can create a dichotomy and division between Daniel 12, Matthew 13, and 1 Corinthians chapter 15, it proves beyond any shadow of a doubt that no matter what our concept of the resurrection might be in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, it occurred when the power of the holy people was completely shattered. We have more on Matthew chapter 13 on the flip side. We'll see you there.